If Xi Jinping could successfully take Taiwan and occupy Taiwan and drive his red flag limousine, over the scorched and kind of smoking avenues of central Taipei with the kind of the Communist Party's flag flying from buildings and PLA troops lining the avenue, then he would undoubtedly enter the pantheon of China's great leaders because he would have finished and won a final victory in the Chinese Civil War that Chairman Mao failed to end because he didn't finish off the regime that went into exile in Taiwan. So yes, he becomes up there with, the Qianlong Emperor or the Yongzheng Emperor, some of the great, expansionist Qing dynasty emperors. But if he tries it and loses, then then he goes down in history as one of the worst Chinese rulers of all time. So it's a big old bet.
This is a conversation with David Rennie, a China-based reporter for The Economist, a head of their Beijing Bureau, and a co-author of an excellent podcast focused on China, The Drum Tower. We talked about whether the Chinese leadership wants to take Taiwan by force, and if it's already preparing to do that. Why the growing disillusionment of the Chinese people with the economy is making the government very nervous, and why even the Chinese government has to care about what people think. So thank you to everyone who has decided to support this podcast on Patreon. It means a lot. And now, enjoy the conversation. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
So I'd like to start, if we can, by maybe asking about what's the general mood on the ground, taking advantage of the fact that, you are in China, because most of the news lately that we see in the Western media about China are fairly negative, and they paint sort of a gloomy picture, whether it's the economy, the recent news about the Chinese demographic decline, and I wonder whether the general mood on the ground in China, even though that's always hard to assess, sort of reflects that, and maybe even whether the same news that we are seeing in Western media outside of China, whether they're similar to what most people in China actually read in Chinese media.
Gosh, that's some very good questions in there. So to sort of try and take a step back. So if you are a journalist or an analyst or anyone living in China trying to understand this place, so clearly one of the largest problems is that it's just enormous. It's 1.4 billion people. So, saying Chinese people think this or that is sort of in and of itself quite a strange claim. So a lot of our work is trying to take the sort of the data that we can see and then add anecdote to it, and to see whether, as you travel around and if you try and make an effort to go to not just the larger cities but to small cities, county towns, the countryside, what is the kind of the overall sense? And even though this is such an enormous country and not monolithic, it has to be said that over the last sort of year or so, I think there is an unmistakable pattern that in different places for different reasons, people are anxious. They are in a funk. They are definitely concerned about they're definitely concerned about the direction of the economy. I think people had a big fright during the pandemic because those lockdowns that affected different bits of China differently, and some people were lucky enough to only be locked down for a relatively short time. Some people were very unlucky. Were in Shanghai when it was locked down extremely tightly for 2 months. Other cities even longer. So there was an element of luck. But by the end of the kind of 2.5 years of the pandemic, almost everyone had been locked down for some weeks at least. And one of the things that keeps coming back even now, more than a year after the end of the pandemic, is that for many Chinese people, that meant going without income, particularly if they were migrant workers or more sort of casual workers, or if they had their own small business, a restaurant, a shop, or a hairdresser's that was closed because of the lockdowns. But they still had car loans to pay back. They still had mortgages to pay back. And so it's fascinating to me that when I talk to people and I try and ask open-ended questions, not are you in a funk, but, how do you feel things are? One of the things that comes up is that people, even if their income is now back to where it should be, and even if they're receiving their salary on time, which is not guaranteed at the moment because a lot of local governments are struggling to pay on time, there's a fear that has lingered with them because they remember how they had to really eat into their savings because they went for, a month, 2 months with no income and still had large bills to pay. And that fear factor is really commonly cited when people say, you know, I'm only buying the things I have to buy. Or if they're a shopkeeper, people are only coming to my shop to buy kind of necessities. But if there's any chance of putting it off, there's any chance of just saving their income, then they will. So that is an unmistakable message that you hear, and that is also reflected in I've deliberately gone to some cities where you could tell that they had had financial difficulties, often because of the spending on sort of pandemic controls. And I set out recently to go to a city which had cancelled its bus services for a while, which was a kind of marker of financial pain. And that was a very interesting trip because it was more or less a year after the end of the pandemic. If you asked sort of people on the street or in shops or in businesses or schools or whatever, point blank, do you think people are sort of still feeling the after effects of the pandemic a year later? They would say, no, no, it's a year ago now. We're not going to start blaming something a year ago. We're glad it's over. We're just going to put it behind us. But then when you ask them how they felt about their kind of confidence or their customers' confidence, they would say, oh, no, things are very bad right now. No one's very confident. No one's spending. And you'd ask them why. And then their explanations were very often bound up with the pandemic. So as we said, people remember that fear of not being able to pay their bills or having to eat into their savings to pay their bills. Other people would say, my brother-in-law is a policeman and he hasn't been paid on time for months now. He eventually gets paid, but he's never been paid on time because the local city government is bankrupt. They spent just so much money building, pop-up quarantine hospitals, or, quite a lot of low-level officials have been made to pay back performance related bonuses going back, 2-3 years, and that's painful. People are very anxious about the property market. Now, not everyone is equally anxious because, a lot of people are still well ahead because they bought an apartment in a city 10 years ago and it's worth double what it was when they paid for it. So they've got a long way to go before they are kind of in real pain. But if you ask people about, the local property market, if you ask people about the local economy, it's really common at the moment to hear people say, well, prices are going down. They're sort of probably 10, 20% down over the last year. So why would you buy an apartment now? Because it's only going to be worth less. Or if you buy an apartment, you wouldn't be able to sell it. So, everyone's just kind of sort of sitting still and hunkering down and saving as much of their income as they can. If you ask people about youth unemployment, which obviously has been in the news outside China because the statistics, particularly on graduate youth unemployment, reached sort of record highs, and then they stopped publishing the statistics, and now they started publishing them with a new methodology, so the number is lower. So that was something that people outside China noticed. If you ask people in China about that, then yeah, they will talk about how, in general terms, it is very hard for young people to get a good job. If they have children who have a graduate education or a college education, they're very worried about them. I mean, one of the most common phrases you hear if you're on a train, if you're talking to people in a street market, if you're talking to people in the shop that they own, and you ask them about kind of the young, they will often say, 生活压力太大了. The pressure of life is just so much. If it's a young man, the fact that he has to buy an apartment, he has to buy a car if he wants to get married. If it's a young woman, the sort of the pressure to get married and have children, the pressure of finding a good job. Anecdotally, and in the Chinese press, a lot of stories about, young graduates sending off hundreds of thousands, in some cases, of job applications, of some kind of white collar jobs being so oversubscribed that you discover that your interview is actually done by a sort of an AI bot. You're not even speaking to a real human being, and how sort of soul destroying that is in some way. So you asked a very good question at the end about how much of this discussion is taking place inside China, whether if you're a Chinese sort of news consumer or media consumer, how much of this do you see? And it's a kind of mixed picture. So you will see in good media outlets here, because there are some good media outlets here, you will see, features about exactly what I was saying, people sending off hundreds of job applications, people being interviewed by AI bots. people being anxious about the property market. So that is part of the discussion. But there is also at the same time an unmistakable push by the censorship machine, which is always extremely powerful and active, to minimize the amount of kind of really frightening news, and particularly news that makes the government look as though it's not doing enough. And so I guess if you wanted to point to, an area where there is probably a very large gap between the reporting that you'd see outside China and the reporting you'd see inside China, take, the several million people who are currently paying mortgages on apartments that have not yet been built or finished. And these are people who have done absolutely nothing wrong. They bought an apartment, they got a mortgage, and yet that apartment has not been delivered because China has this strange kind of Ponzi scheme property sector where you buy the apartment up front and the developer then takes the money for the next project. But those millions of people, you can read in foreign news reporting that sometimes they will go and stand outside the headquarters of the biggest property developers, and I've seen them myself outside a country garden, the one that's in trouble at the moment. You will not see their stories in the Chinese press, and they will often be warned by the police not to speak to journalists. They'll be told to stop petitioning, though they've done nothing wrong. They've broken no law, but there is a kind of absolute emphasis on sort of positive energy. And I also know, because I've been told it directly, that if you are a kind of an economist for a bank in mainland China, or an analyst who might speak to financial journalists in China, there is now strong pressure not to, talk down the economy. If you say something negative and is quoted by a journalist in the Chinese press, then you, as the bank analyst or economist, will get a phone call telling you to stop it. And so there is a gap. The final thing I would say that is really important to try and convey, I think, from here in China is a kind of counterpoint, which is that things are bad here. Things are definitely, everyone will tell you that this year is bad, that the brief post-pandemic boost, the beginning of 2023, did not last. That's a consensus. Small business people will tell you that they're suffering. Sort of larger businesses in some sectors, they're selling, but they're not making any money because prices are really coming down. There's tremendous overcapacity in some sectors. So there's a lot of pain in the system. One thing, though, that is different about China to, say, the United States or the UK or probably the Czech Republic, is that this degree of pain in terms of someone who didn't get paid for months, or someone whose apartment is worth maybe 20 or 30% less than they paid for it, which is something that does happen here. In America, if you look at the numbers, the Federal Reserve has done studies, a terrifying number of ordinary Americans. I think they did a study once saying, could you make a $400 car repair bill this month if you suddenly had to do it? And I'm going to get the number wrong, but it was something terrifying. Like 40% of Americans could not pay a $400 unexpected car repair bill. They just didn't have any cushion at all. And a lot of people in certainly the UK, certainly until recently, would have, maybe an 80% mortgage where they had only put 20% of the money down on the apartment, or an 85% mortgage in some cases. In America, even higher multiples. So clearly, if you have an 80% mortgage or a 90% mortgage and the property goes down by 20, 30%, you're underwater. And that, immediately sends really strong signals of pain through the system. China is different. China, ordinary Chinese people, partly because, the health insurance system is very, very skimpy, particularly in the countryside. People are terrified of the unexpected costs of having to go to the hospital, pay for medicines. So they save a huge percentage of their income, a fifth, a quarter, a third of their income goes into saving for a rainy day. So when ordinary Chinese, even migrant workers on low incomes, don't get paid for 2 months, they're not finished financially in the way that I think their counterparts in the West might be. And it's very common for mortgage rules to be very, very conservative here. It varies from city to city, but people might have a 50% mortgage or a 60% mortgage. And so actually it takes a long time for the pain to feed through. So there's definitely no doubt that for the first time in the lives of some young Chinese, the economy is not booming away, that things are not improving every year. And that if you're in your 20s, that's a real shock because you've only known a China that's rising. And so that is a big deal, and we should take it seriously. But I think it's useful for people outside China to bear in mind that there are sources of resilience based on, very large precautionary savings, and things like very conservative mortgage rules, and the fact that people may have borrowed from their own family to buy an apartment rather than borrowed from the bank. And so people are not desperate. The mood here is not kind of revolution. People are not sort of on the barricades. They're fed up and they're anxious. And there's a sense that they're not quite sure why the government isn't stepping in and kind of fixing this in the way that seemed to sort of work last time. That's, I guess, the mood. There's a sort of sense of drift and anxiety, I guess.
Well, you sort of hinted at something that I wanted to follow up with, and that's whether the loss of confidence and the anxiousness is only limited to the economy, or whether the people who are seeing China struggle for maybe the first time in their lives, if they feel a loss of confidence in the government as well, and maybe the future, the bright future of the country as well.
So that's where it really is important not to generalize, because this is a big country and there are a lot of people who are still very proud of their country's rise. And, it's been rising for the kind of 50 years that they've been alive, or the 40 years that they've been alive. And that makes them very willing to kind of give the benefit of the doubt to the leadership. And, there have even been protests, which I think were sometimes mischaracterized in the outside as, the largest protest since Tiananmen Square. And so people assumed, oh, okay, that must be a sort of explicitly anti-communist party kind of revolutionary protest. But it's complicated, right? Some of the protests at the end of the pandemic were migrant workers, protesting to be allowed to go to work and earn some money. Or they were factory workers demanding to be allowed out of their factory because they were frightened that people in their dormitory might have COVID. Or they were, even, I was at the white paper protests in Beijing, which, constantly get talked up as this kind of stunning rebuke for the party. And there was a bit of that, but there were also people there who just wanted the pandemic controls to be lifted and wanted the government to be more kind of responsive and accountable. But they were very, very careful to frame their complaints as patriotic and to, sing the national anthem or to sing, to make sure that they were not challenging the party directly. So it's complicated. There are more people now than usual, more people than, I used to hear when I first arrived here this time 6 years ago, certainly very many more than when I was here 25 years ago for my first posting. It is more common now to hear people express doubt that the top leadership knows what they're doing. There is, I think, disappointment. And I think the end of the pandemic left its mark on some people. There's a non-trivial number of Chinese who lost an elderly family member to the virus at the end of the pandemic when we had this chaotic opening because they basically lost control of the virus. Couldn't their control methods, which had worked unbelievably well at the beginning, were just overwhelmed by the fact that Omicron, it just spreads too fast. It's just too contagious. And I have spoken to a significant number of ordinary Chinese who, when you ask them about the end of the pandemic, they say a lot of people died and it was covered up, and they know this because their parent, in some cases, or one of their family members died of COVID, and the doctor was not allowed to write COVID on the death certificate. I was in, township level hospitals in rural Henan just after the chaotic ending of the pandemic controls. I spoke to doctors myself in a hospital who told me, I'm not allowed to write COVID on the death certificate. That can only be written by someone much higher up the system than me. So we're just saying they're dying of fever or respiratory disease or heart attack or something. And so there is absolutely no doubt that a non-trivial number of people, 1 million, maybe more, died in those last very chaotic moments of the pandemic. And that had an effect. I think if you talk to college students who were at university in that last year of the pandemic, college campuses in some cities were really, really strictly locked down, and it was just miserable. And, they spent weeks with, metal fences, locking them in their dormitories. And I think a lot of those same kind of young 20-somethings, they were some of the most patriotic sort of Chinese you would normally talk to, because they really only knew a kind of rising China. And I think for them, again, it's anecdote, not data, but you can certainly hear people whose faith in the system was really shaken, because they knew that it wasn't a democracy. They knew that there was censorship. They knew that there were controls on their freedom, but they sort of understood that that was the deal, and that the deal was that the government, the party that's in charge, knows what it's doing. And I think there was a tremendous disappointment that actually at the end, because people were very proud of the way that the pandemic controls worked in the first year and a bit, and the contrast with the kind of the chaos they're being shown on state TV, the images from America or Europe. But at the end, people were very disappointed. I think business people are very anxious, and they're not quite sure why the government isn't sort of responding, why the government doesn't seem to have a kind of a grip on this. Um, the elites, the kind of the Beijing liberal elites, the foreign educated technocrats or foreign educated professionals, the people who I could meet at a sort of a reception where kind of people like me and diplomats mix with sort of Chinese elites, they're definitely very fed up and more willing to kind of grumble than has been the case for a very long time, and to grumble about the kind of the people at the top just not knowing what they're doing. And uh, one of the consequences of centralizing power very, very visibly around one man, Xi Jinping, and creating a Politburo standing committee, which was widely understood by people who kind of follow the news here as a standing committee of Xi Jinping loyalists, people who'd worked with him for years and years and years. One of the consequences of that degree of absolute centralization and the absolute focus on personalizing governance here as the wisdom of Xi Jinping is that when people are not sure that the leadership knows what it's doing, then it's very hard to shield the guy at the top. And so I think there is, the flip side of, there's this political science term of performance legitimacy, that, a government like China's, which doesn't have an election mandate because it doesn't win elections, has performance legitimacy. It can point to the growing economy or its competence, or the fact that people are safe. People do still acknowledge that the economy in their lifetimes has got, much larger, that life is more prosperous, that, in many ways cities have been, dramatically modernized in many bits of China. There's high-speed trains. People are very proud of all of those things. But there are now elements of the governing performance that they're just not, they're not sure why it's not working properly, and they are definitely disappointed. And so that is something that is definitely out there.
Are the people at the top nervous about this? Or maybe to ask more specifically, are they actually aware of this shift of public opinions? And if they are, to what extent do you think they feel nervous about it? Because, and obviously it's quite hard, I assume, to know what the government or the people at the top of the Chinese leadership system might be thinking. But I imagine that if I was in their shoes, I would probably be quite nervous about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, a starting point is, a journalist like me does not get to meet Xi Jinping. We don't get to meet members of the Politburo Standing Committee. This is a very, very closed country. So, someone like me, if I'm lucky, I get to meet a vice minister sometimes, or a director general in in an important ministry. And if you're very lucky, you can have an off the record conversation and really get somewhere. Or there are certain scholars who you learn over time, partly because they can kind of tell you things before they become public in terms of the kind of the party line. You realize that they are, among those scholars who receive the internal memos setting the party line on a given question. So you learn that they are worth talking to. So those people are undoubtedly very concerned with public opinion, and have always been. I mean, one of the things that sort of the Chinese Communist Party has tried to do over kind of recent years is to use modern tools of sort of social media monitoring, or sort of opinion polling they do polling as far as we can tell. You can occasionally meet academics who do kind of private polling for the party or for the government. We know that there are private tech companies that have quite lucrative contracts to sample public opinion by kind of surveying social media, because you can sometimes meet those tech people and they'll tell you about those contracts. You can infer, almost like a sort of photographic negative, you can infer what they are potentially worried about at the top by the things that the censors immediately sort of delete. And so, if something is starting to become a subject of discussion, and then the censors really kind of flood the internet, and suddenly every trace of that subject disappears very quickly, then as a kind of negative, you can see, okay, well, that must worry them. Something has, the order has gone out, and that subject has kind of disappeared. And you can see a kind of heavy-handedness. So, I mean, I can give you a concrete example, really remarkable example. When the last Prime Minister, Li Keqiang, who stepped down at the beginning of March 2023 after, 2 terms of absolute loyal service, never challenging Xi Jinping, really never actually fulfilling the hopes that some liberals had of him, that he might be a kind of liberal reformer. He was really in many ways a sort of a disappointment. But he retires in good standing, and then he dies as far as we know, heart attack swimming in Shanghai. And the mourning that was then kind of spontaneously visible. I mean, I went to his supposed home village, his ancestral village in Anhui, although actually he didn't spend much time there, and actually a house that he did spend quite a lot of time in the capital of Anhui, Hefei. And there were absolutely enormous crowds laying flowers. And two things were very obvious when you kind of covered that story. Number one, when you spoke to at least some of the Chinese laying flowers, you couldn't help but kind of infer from the way that they were praising Li Keqiang that there was a kind of veiled critique of Xi Jinping, that they would praise him for being willing to admit that the party had not fulfilled all of its promises to raise everyone's incomes, that he was often praised for being willing to acknowledge that some people at the bottom of Chinese society remained very, very badly paid, or that the pandemic had been brutal for many families and that it had been financially frightening, something that you would never, ever hear from Xi Jinping or from the sort of the immediate kind of propaganda machine around him. So I think it was reasonable to infer that when Chinese people said, the thing I liked about Li Keqiang was that, that willingness to acknowledge that people suffered during the pandemic, I think it was not unreasonable to infer that there was a kind of veiled criticism of the current leader. But the other thing that you could also notice as a foreign journalist on the streets of Hefei next to the house, with these vast crowds laying these kind of chrysanthemum, yellow and white chrysanthemum flowers, these bouquets of mourning flowers, was there were police everywhere. And very quickly, as a foreign journalist, you would be kind of followed. Plainclothes people would be listening in. Plainclothes people would kind of interrupt your interviews, would follow you into a home to stop you interviewing people. And so the machine did not like mourning for Xi Jinping, for Li Keqiang. And since then, we've seen, and there's a good business paper, Saitin, which had a number of stories deleted very quickly by censors at the beginning of the year. One of the stories that got censored was their roundup of people who died in 2023. And the top name on their list was the former prime minister, the former second ranking official in the Communist Party, Li Keqiang. And that got the piece deleted. And, if you stop to think about that, I mean, he's not a criminal. He's not a dissident. He never challenged Xi Jinping. So what can it possibly mean that he is now a sort of unperson? And I think, and this is kind of maybe it sounds ridiculous that we in Beijing spend our time analyzing this stuff, but that's what you have to, that's the kind of Kremlinology that in 2023, in an age when, Western leaders are on Twitter sharing their kind of innermost thoughts, we're reduced to trying to kind of work out what it means that, why did the police not let me do those interviews? Why did the censors delete that article? And that's kind of how we try and reverse engineer a sense of what worries the leadership.
I think it's quite interesting because it sounds similar to the responses I get when talking to Russia scholars and Russia watchers, who often say that in theory, Putin wouldn't need to care about the public opinion, because he has this robust repression machine, and it's not like elections can change anything. But in practice, he actually enormously cares and is kind of obsessed with the public opinion. So I guess it's sort of similar in China.
Yeah, and we see, I mean, going back to your first question about the state of the economy, I mean, the propaganda machine, in the journals which are designed to instruct party members about the line to take, things like the People's Daily, there are endless kind of pieces by the propaganda bureau of the Central Committee saying, we must increase our work on public opinion guidance. We must ensure that the economy is just discussed and reported and analyzed in ways that reflect positive energy and do not allow kind of hostile foreign forces to try to lower the morale of the Chinese people. And people in the financial sector get memos telling them not to talk down the economy. And there's a lot of language in there about public opinion guidance, because I mean, all leaders would rather not have to kind of hit people with sticks to govern. The Chinese Communist Party is also it is absolutely concerned with being a mass movement. It likes to be on the side of the majority, and I think that one of the sort of aspects of governance in this country that is a challenge if you are a sort of Western liberal, and I work for a news magazine that is unashamedly a Western liberal news magazine. One of the challenges is that very often Chinese policy is aimed at trying to ensure it's a kind of utilitarian structure. It's designed to try and deliver a certain set of public goods chosen and selected by the Communist Party to a majority of the people. And so, they know that people like the fact that Chinese cities are amazingly safe. And that's because they are very tightly policed and there's security cameras everywhere. But it is, you can walk down the streets of Beijing at 2 a.m. in a way that would be unwise in New York or London or Berlin. And that's an achievement. It's aimed at the kind of the majority who will accept the trade-offs in terms of privacy and policing to live in a safe, orderly, stable society. We saw this with the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic, zero COVID, which was, I was here for the entire of the pandemic. I was stuck in China for, nearly 3 years. It was at times unbelievably suffocating and frustrating and brutal, certainly if you're a Westerner. But it was a numbers game. It was aimed at ensuring that a majority of Chinese at any one time could live more or less normal lives, albeit with lots of testing and intrusions, but that a minority of people would be locked in their homes for weeks on end in unlucky places so that the majority of China would be okay. And, a lot of the framing of social questions by the Communist Party is about how the vast majority of law-abiding patriotic citizens support this or that policy, and only a tiny minority who have been misled by often, hostile foreign forces are, in disagreement, and they would apply that to, they say that the vast majority of Taiwanese would like to be reunited with the mainland. The vast majority of Chinese support, the Communist Party. They're very proud of these kind of data points. This is a majoritarian, utilitarian system. I mean, one final quick example is, outsiders, including me, find it very shocking the way that the government under Xi Jinping has imposed kind of coercive assimilation on minorities like the Uyghurs or the Hui Muslims or others. Mongolian language being basically eliminated from schools. And to us, that treatment of a minority is an unacceptable trade-off if your goal is national unity. But for the Chinese Communist Party, their view is, we need a peaceful, stable China. 90-something% of the country are Han Chinese. So this is just going to be how it works. And the very, very strict, intense security and kind of surveillance in Xinjiang is popular with lots and lots of Chinese tourists who love going to Xinjiang and dressing up as Uyghurs. And they will say, this place used to be really dangerous. There used to be kind of bombs and knife attacks, and now it's super safe. It's lovely, great. Come and have a holiday in Xinjiang. And so that majoritarian kind of project is absolutely the goal of the Communist Party. The problem is the price that minorities have to pay, and they could be an ethnic minority, they could be feminists, they could be gay students with a LGBT group on campus that gets shut down. They could be an unlucky minority whose apartment hasn't been finished and they paid for it and they go and petition, but they must be crushed and silenced and censored because it's upsetting the majority. So you're absolutely right that the party is very concerned with public opinion and with being on the sort of the side of the broad majority. This is not North Korea. This is not sort of Stalin's Soviet Union. But the price for that majoritarian project is that minorities, some of whom are just unlucky and in the wrong place at the wrong time, they will be repressed without mercy.
So I wanted to use something that we've talked about to segue into the next topic, and that's talking about all the problems that China is dealing with, and maybe the rising discontent of the public. There's this quite common narrative or theory that's often mentioned by Western analysts and officials that you've mentioned in your last episode of Drum Tower, and that's that maybe the Chinese government could try to take the attention of the public away from these internal issues by focusing on a more aggressive foreign policy, and specifically that maybe if it would get really bad, it could try to launch an invasion of Taiwan to sort of stoke the nationalism and find a solution that way. And in your last episode, you quoted a memo from a 4-star U.S. general who said that my gut, to quote him, my gut tells me that we will fight in 2025, talking about Chinese invasion of Taiwan, potential invasion of Taiwan. And using that quote after making an episode asking whether Chinese people want that, what does your gut tell you about all of this?
So I think I'm less alarmed than that 4-star Air Force general. I'm also less alarmed than, actually, I got in some ways a more significant figure who was also, we played a clip of him in the episode that you're talking about, was H.R. McMaster, who used to be National Security Advisor and is a kind of very thoughtful former general who wrote some interesting books of history about kind of failures of strategy in previous American wars, Vietnam. So McMaster, we played this clip of McMaster talking in Congress about how as the Chinese economy slows and the policy mistakes by the party look obvious, then, they're going to amp up the nationalism. They're going to whip up the nationalism above all around Taiwan. I don't completely buy, in fact, I don't buy this idea. Well, I don't think we're going to have a war next year. And I also don't really think that a war to take back Taiwan is a sort of safe enough, self-contained operation that would be a kind of useful distraction. I mean, we have seen dictatorships and unfree regimes launch wars before. I mean, the Argentine junta invaded the Falkland Islands to try and distract people from their kind of discontents. Arguably, Putin very successfully invaded and occupied Crimea in 2014. And that, gave him a huge boost in his popularity. And so, these kind of adventures can, there is history. People do these things. But invading Taiwan would not be like kind of occupying Crimea. Invading Taiwan has been described to me by one Pentagon planner as, the largest amphibious operation since the Allied invasion of Normandy in D-Day during the Second World War, but more difficult because the English Channel was 23 miles wide or whatever it is. The Taiwan Straits are 4 times wider and very deep and very rough. And so it's an unbelievably risky operation. And so point one, if you were looking to distract a discontented public, then invading and trying to conquer and occupy an island of 24 million people, which has a kind of theoretical American security backing over 100 miles of rough deep sea, that's a big distraction. That's like betting the entire Communist Party on that war. And so that is, I think, a reason to assume that until they feel they have no choice, or until they are confident the Americans would not come, uh, then it would be an unbelievably risky thing to do. Another reason that I don't think, my gut doesn't tell me we fight in 2025, to quote that general, is the pain, the economic pain, the human pain, the difficulties would be so great that I think you would need to see the propaganda machine here getting people kind of into a frenzy, uh, getting people, really stoked up about the idea that China is being humiliated, that the Americans are attacking China, that the future of China lies in, ending the division of, the mainland from Taiwan. And, there's language like that in Taiwan policy papers, but that's not the main thrust of messaging right now. The main thrust of messaging right now is all about getting the economy back on track. It's about prosperity. It's about, um, it's about, the one, if you watch the state evening news, the Xinhua Lianbo, the news that, hundreds of millions of ordinary Chinese watch every night, you know, yes, there are shots of aircraft carriers and fighter jets and missiles. They like to talk about how strong the PLA is. And yes, they talk about, how a tiny minority of splitters from Taiwan must, be careful. But look at their response to the most recent Taiwan election, where the party that they didn't like, the candidate that they didn't like, won the presidential election, Lai Ching-te, giving the party that China does not like, that it sees as a kind of splittist pro-independence party, giving them another term, a third presidential term in a row, which is certainly not what China wanted. What did we see from the Chinese propaganda machine, from state officials, the Taiwan Affairs Office? It was very much a kind of lowering of the tensions. It was, well, yes, Lai Ching-te, needs to be very careful and not provoke us. And, we're very, we'll be watching him. But his party lost the parliamentary elections held on the same day. His party clearly does not represent the majority opinion on Taiwan. We still have time. It was definitely a kind of, the message to the Chinese public was, stay calm. We have time. Taiwan isn't walking away. The wrong people won the presidency, but the right people potentially won the parliamentary elections. And I thought that was revealing, that it was not in the interests of the propaganda machine to stoke kind of wild rage, because the time is not right. They're very focused on trying to get the economy up and running. Does that mean that war is completely unthinkable? I wish I could say it were, because it would be a war that could very easily turn into a war very fast with Japan and with America, and then we'd have two nuclear armed superpowers at war, which is just a terrifying prospect. It should be unimaginable. It's not completely unimaginable, and I think I could get very concerned if I set out to get concerned about scenarios which I know are being discussed in the Pentagon or by other governments about blockades, China declaring that they're going to be doing sort of missile tests to the north and south of Taiwan. That basically means it's not safe for any cargo ship to deliver any goods into Taiwan. And they keep that up for a few weeks. Taiwan has no oil and gas of its own. It has no energy stocks of its own. It imports all its energy and a lot of its food and stuff. So that could get very rough. That could get nasty. So there's room for kind of gloom on that front. But the idea that it's imminent, and certainly the idea that the Chinese Communist Party would think it as a useful distraction to launch the Taiwan invasion, I think it's too big, too risky, too dangerous, and you don't hear them getting public opinion ready for that, even over the kind of the medium term. So that's why, I mean, if I thought it was going to be, war next year, I probably wouldn't be sitting here in Beijing. I'd be thinking about getting out.
I think I agree completely that the risk is completely enormous, and actually at this point the invasion would probably fail. And I think it's really interesting to hear that if the invasion might be about to happen, we would see the Chinese domestic propaganda just going into an overdrive before that. But I also wonder, because listening to your podcast Drum Tower, I feel like there are these recurring themes that come up that sort of seem like uh, the Chinese government laying groundwork for not launching an invasion in near term next year, but for at least creating conditions for it to be able to do that if they decide to do it in sort of midterm. And I'm talking about, whether that's is sort of the nationalistic and anti-American, anti-Western propaganda, or the obsession with food security and stocking up on huge supplies of food, or policies and statements from Xi and other officials that actually the economy is no longer a priority for China and that Chinese people should learn to eat bitterness. And I wonder if you read this in a similar way, that it's sort of putting blocks and foundations for a future Xi a couple of years down the line to be in a position where they can make that decision, or if those things are completely unrelated and there's a different explanation.
So I think that you're definitely right to notice that that is a kind of a theme. I'm not hopefully not an obsession of drum tires, but yeah, there is a lot of real world policy that seems to support the rhetoric from Xi Jinping on down about the need to harden China's kind of defenses, to become more self-reliant, to become more resilient, to be less dependent on the outside world for chokehold technologies or food or energy. There is absolutely tremendous, the number of securities we now have. It's not just national security and economic security and food security; it's energy security. It's we now have cultural security. I think that was one of the latest ones about there is a tremendous effort to harden the country. I think that some of that, if you do Xi Jinping the favor of taking his words at face value, is a belief that China is in a dangerous world and that there are storms and tempests and that he is guiding the ship of state through this dangerous world. And that means you have to, harden yourself. You have to defend yourself. As you say, that the young need to be less soft, less spoilt. They need to be willing to serve the nation. Part of that, I think, is an analysis, a genuine analysis, that they look at, the American-led West becoming less welcoming and less accepting of Chinese goods and less willing to kind of transfer technology. They sense decoupling underway, so they are kind of preemptively decoupling in some ways. So that is a real-world defensive shift, and you can see that in terms of, you say food security, technological self-resilience, but also in some really interesting ways, things like sort of financial resilience. We know that Chinese officials have been in Russia studying how Russia has survived the sanctions imposed after the invasion of Ukraine, and looking at how actually the Russian economy is doing better than many people expected it to. And so we see ways in which China is trying to build alternatives to the international payments transfer systems that have been used to sanction the Iranians over the years, or to impose pain on Russia. Things like SWIFT, the international payment system, or the use of the dollar and the American banking system's ability to kind of sanction foreign banks. China watches all of that, and we can see them patiently building real world things designed to try and increase the amount of oil that China pays for with its own currency, or to try and increase alternative payment systems. Certainly an effort that is defensive. But I do think there is also something that is not purely defensive and not purely a kind of sort of a construction of a fortress China because China feels under attack. I think there is evidence, again, looking at Xi Jinping's kind of most authoritative speeches, including his address to the 20th Party Congress, or some of his speeches immediately afterwards, which in the Communist Party kind of canon is like a kind of papal bull. It is the highest level of authority. There you could see a sort of an appeal to purify and strengthen the Communist Party and below it the entire of China by somehow recapturing the essence of an older, simpler, more sort of expeditionary, revolutionary China. Now, it doesn't mean revolution in its sort of revolutionary sense, because he's a very conservative leader, but you see these constant appeals to a kind of an imagined kind of age of purity and simplicity, where the very early pioneers of the Communist Party were willing to risk their comfort and their lives, kind of riding mules up into the mountains to save the peasants, to lead the revolution. That they didn't have any possessions, there was no money, there was no corruption. They were serving the people. It's this kind of, often the language is weirdly sort of faith tinged. It's about kind of martyrs and red faith and red fire and the kind of the revolutionary DNA, and almost as if they're kind of an atheist church, sort of missionaries, with a kind of with a kind of a sacred vocation to strengthen the country. And I think there is an unmistakable sense that if you look at some of the Xi Jinping language or some of the big campaigns around Xi Jinping thought on culture or red tourism or some of the propaganda movies that we see at the moment, their depiction of kind of Chinese soldiers suffering unimaginable torments, or young people kind of risking everything for the motherland, or their kind of focus on getting school groups and universities and companies to visit sites where people dug tunnels through mountains with their bare hands, and all of those kind of themes. I think that they're not just a kind of response to a real threat that they perceive right now from America. It's also a belief that a more kind of expeditionary China that is somehow on a sort of campaign footing, where the party is kind of has its kind of metaphorical kind of rucksack on its back and straw sandals on their feet, and they're kind of marching up a cliff into the sort of mountaintops. That's the vision of the party that Xi Jinping constantly promotes. And the party that he doesn't like is a corrupt fat cat local official in a kind of tinted windowed Audi, kind of heading away from a kind of drunken banquet with his capitalist friends. That's the party that Xi Jinping clearly believes is very unpopular. That if the party remained sort of seen as that party, he has said himself that when he took over, the party had lost its way, that it was not popular, it was out of touch with the masses, it was seen as decadent and elite and all of those things. And so it's a kind of a reframing, if you like, of the social compact. I wouldn't say there's a social contract. Something much more, it's a return of the party as a very visible guiding kind of moral force in everyday life that touches the lives of ordinary citizens in a way that really wasn't true when I was first here as a journalist in the late 90s. Ideologies return to kind of everyday life. And the promise is that the party is a kind of vanguard, the best of the best, the purest of the pure, kind of working sleepless nights for the good of the kind of the people out there in the kind of the far-flung corners of China. And so I think all of that is of a piece. So you can't separate all of this kind of preparation for a more resilient, tougher, more sort of missionary ideological China. Doesn't mean that they think the Americans are going to invade next week, but it's also just the party that he wants to lead, I think.
I think one final question on Taiwan would be, I'd like to hear your opinion on another theory that's quite common in among the Western analysts, and that's an idea that China has, it's sometimes called the peak China theory, and it's basically the idea that China has already peaked in terms of economy, demography, and that in terms of military, it's going to peak in the next few years. And the idea is that it's often not the rising powers that are the most dangerous, but it's the powers that have reached their peak, and they know that if they want to really achieve some major change of the international order and to really improve their standing, they have to act now. And I wonder, and I think that now it's sort of mainstream to see China in that way, that it has already peaked and it's probably not going to overtake the US economy, and that its growth is going to slow down, and that it's not really going up anymore, but rather it's starting to decline, and it's probably not going to be the Chinese century as we maybe thought. And I wonder what are your thoughts on that, and whether that could influence the thinking of the Chinese government around Taiwan and its foreign policy, and also whether that idea is to an extent, do you think, shared by anyone in China, if people maybe see China in that way as well, or not at all? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
How do you govern Taiwan the day after? If there are millions of students in the streets of the capital, Taipei, who gets them off the streets? Do you shoot them? Do you kill them? Do you run them over with tanks? What do you do? That's the amazing thing about being a foreign journalist based in Beijing in 2023, is our life is not radically different maybe from a foreign journalist trying to cover Moscow in the 1950s. We're looking at the front page of the newspapers to see who's missing from the photograph. And then, waiting some weeks to find out that they've disappeared. The smartest people who know China well, who are pessimistic and worried about the future, the argument that they come up with tends to be some variant on Xi Jinping as an individual leader needs this for his legacy. That there is evidence that he would like this to be done while he's still in charge.